Awesome. Hello. Well, thank you everyone for coming. It's great to see a nice full room. Before we start, just one thing. Our team made us these really great jumpers to wear, but clearly I'm already sweating. So just imagine, if you will, that I'm wearing this jumper throughout the presentation, and that'll be great. No one needs to know. Okay, so welcome to my presentation, Sounds of Night City. I will be your tour guide today as we take a trip through some of the audio technology that we made for Cyberpunk 2077. First, I would like to take a little trip back in time to 2015 and the release of The Witcher 3, a game you may have heard of. Is there anyone who hasn't played Witcher 3, by the way? There's one. Man, you're wearing our shirt even. Come on. Okay, I will get you a copy after the show. Okay, so Witcher 3, it was a pretty good game. I think most people seem to enjoy this, and an important fact about this, that it was released with, I think also I really enjoy the sound in this, and it was released with 0 audio coders. So the release actually happened almost exactly, I think, 8 years ago this month, and that was also the time that I joined CD Projekt. So 1 year later, we had the episodes, Hearts of Stone, Blood and Wine, and by the end of this, that we had 2 audio coders. So it may seem odd that I start my presentation about audio technology saying, yes, you can release a game with pretty good sound and not have audio coders, but there it is. Hopefully I'll be able to catch up during the rest of the presentation and maybe convince you that it is a good idea to have some audio coders and not get myself out of a job. Okay, so let's fast forward now to 2022. So we're 2 years after the release of Cyberpunk 2077, and at this point we have a few patches out. The game is at this point doing pretty well, and we have 5 audio coders and 1 audio contractor working on tech for us. So a big change from the 0 that we had in 2015 to that. So just to say hello to all of these. So Colin Walder, that's me. We also have Maciej Paczynski, Marek Bielawski, Miguel Mendez, Giuseppe Marano, and Dan Murray was our contractor from Otic Software. So just what did we do in between 2015 and 2022? Did we just scroll Facebook? Not only this, we did do actually some work. And what we had, of course, was a whole new world to create. So we changed from The Witcher 3, which is a fantasy setting, action RPG, to Cyberpunk 2077, which is a cyberpunk setting. Very different world, very different needs, different scale as well. So let's take a little bit of a look at those things. So if we think about the setting for The Witcher 3, we have all of the usual suspects here. Of course, we need our locomotion. We have lots of melee combat with our swords. Natural elements is a big part of the game of crafting the sound, detail in there. Of course, we're a story-based game, so voices, really important to us, and as well with the music to create the narrative. And since we're a monster hunting game, yes, there are some monsters in there. And when we look at Cyberpunk 2077, we have basically all of those things, maybe not monsters, but instead we have vehicles, which is a whole big category by itself. The city ambience now, which has just more things that can make sound, more intense, more busy. And on top of the melee weapons, of course, that we have the guns. And even those melee weapons, they need more distinct sounds, more different kinds of sounds, and the guns themselves, which is a whole big topic to expand on. So we have lots more types of things to have. And if we think about the scale, well, Witcher 3 itself is not a small game. We have, in terms of audio, 4.5 hours of music there, 40,000 sounds in Wise, and 414,000 lines of dialogue at launch. There have been some additional languages added since, and this is across all of the languages that we have in the game. So pretty decent numbers there. But when we compare Cyberpunk 2077, 19 hours of music, 100,000 sounds, 880,000 lines of recorded dialogue, and actually that's a conservative number. I think the real number is slightly bigger than this. Mikołaj Szwed is with us today. He can give you an up-to-date number of this. So huge increase in scale here, like twice as much, at least some cases 4 times as much content that we have to get into the game. So we're dealing with two things. We have new types of things that we have to represent through audio, and also we have to be able to deal with the scale, both in terms of actually creating this content, having the pipelines that we can get this into the game in the first place, and then at runtime, how are we going to actually handle having all of that content and have it in such a way that it's not just a big mess. Right? This is also wants to have good sound. So we're going to focus today really around a few topics that come together when we're thinking about how do we bring Night City to life. So one of the repeating ideas that we had, one of the things that we really focused on in our mind when we're thinking about the sound and the game in general is Night City itself is almost like a character in the game. Even we might consider this to be a main antagonist in our story. So it was really important to us that it felt alive, that it felt vibrant, that it felt immersive, that the player, when they're in Night City, they have this experience of, yes, this is almost like a real place, of course, like hyper-real in some cases. So we can't look at all of the audio technologies, we don't have time, but I would like to focus on today a bit about the voiceovers, about the ambience we talked about there, and then to dive into two specific technologies that we developed, the broadcaster emitter system, and also the SFX container system, which were ways about how we delivered this content. Let's take a drink, important to stay hydrated. Okay, so VO. And for our VO, we really had one way to implement all of the VO into the game, and this was through the scenes. So we have narrative VO, and I'm not going to talk too much about this. Actually, Mikołaj, who's here, he has a presentation just following this one, which will talk a bit about the localization and the VO pipelines, so I recommend going into that. But I would like to take a specific look at a case of combat VO that we had. So we had this mandate or this direction that when we have combat in the game, in the city, that we wanted the NPCs to feel like they're alive, feel like they're communicating with each other, feel like they're communicating with the player, which means that we needed them to be kind of chatty. We needed them to say lots of VO lines, to be really like vocalizing a lot, because this is how we build our connection and we feel really the life in characters. Of course, at the same time, if we start to repeat our VO lines too much, then we immediately get this uncanny valley. We immediately feel it just ourselves, very quickly we know that this is artificial, we just feel that this is artificial. So how can we balance these two things, where we both want to have as much VO as possible, but also as little repetition as possible? So we have a system, combat VO system. It's going to take inputs from the game. We see here, like things like a grenade has happened. Maybe someone needs to shout to take cover to their partners. Maybe the player's been hit, and we want to hear the NPCs say, "Yes, I hit the player." Or maybe we want to see that someone's flanking the NPCs, like the players coming around the side, or maybe vice versa. So the combat system is going to take in these inputs, and then it's going to make a choice between these three things that we see on the right here, the voices, the barks, and the grunts. So let's take a little listen, and hopefully this will work.
Grenade! Hey, move your asses! They're zeroing us! Ugh! Loop around him!
So here we can see that we have these voice lines, but we also have, let's say, some different styles with our voices, our barks, and our grunts. And the difference between these is voices. These are the normal voice lines. They're a full sentence usually, maybe even a couple, the most interesting lines that we have. The barks, these are shorter sentences, or even just a single word, very often a swear word, because this is something that we can repeat very frequently, and still it kind of feels natural. Well, maybe depending on how you use language, but to a lot of this can feel natural to reuse these. And then at the bottom level, we have our grunts. So this is a vocalization, doesn't need to be localized, and actually is very repeatable because it doesn't have any language associated with it, no words. So we can still have the experience that they're reacting somehow, but not actually needing to have that repetition. Of course, we want as many of the voices as possible to create that interesting feeling, to create that connection without it feeling repetitive, and then going down to the barks and the grunts. So how this is working, let's take a theoretical example. So at point 1, it's a point in time, and we're going to get the signal from the game. It's going to come to the NPC, and they're going to say a voice line about whatever it is. A small amount of time is going to pass, and another signal, maybe a similar signal, is going to come in and say, hey, I want to speak again. And at this point, we're going to compare with some cooldown timers, and we have 2 cooldown timers, both local for the NPC itself and a global one across all NPCs. And we're going to ask, okay, has enough time passed that we can we say a voice line? Well, no, it's too soon, since we've previously had a voice line, definitely from this one character, from this NPC, but also from anyone. We want to have like a little bit of a gap, a bit of space there. Can we say a bark? Can we say one of these one-word lines of dialogue? No, this is too soon. Can we say the grunt? Well, still, for this one NPC, it's too soon for us to have the grunt. We want them to have a bit of breathing room, but now someone else could say a grunt. So we can start to have some voices coming from some vocalizations coming from different locations among the NPCs. A bit more time is going to pass. We're going to come to time number 3 here. Still, it's too soon for us to have voices, either from the NPC that originally spoke, or from any others. But okay, enough time has passed now that someone else can say a bark. It's not going to be overlapping too much. There's going to feel a little bit natural that we have some gap there, but we're going to hold off on any barks from our original NPC. It's okay now for them to have a grunt. So if they're going to be hit, if they're going to need to react to the player, okay, we can hear something now from that NPC if we need to. Again, a bit more time has passed, and now finally we're ready to have another voice line, still not from this original one, so this is some short amount of time, measured in seconds, not from this original one, but we can have an interesting voice line coming from some other character. And this way we're going to spread out that dialogue over time. It's not going to bunch down too much. It's going to spread between the different NPCs, and still then we're going to have our barks coming in, we're going to have our grunts to fill the space between that. Also, we wanted to have, as I mentioned, some kind of interaction between the people, and we didn't have the scope really to be able to create a custom dialogues for these, to actually have real answers and responses that were scripted. But what we could do was create a simple answer system. So in this case, it's a system where we have our samurai face with his red eye in the middle there. He's going
On me, all of you.
Say something, and we see here how much better the writing is in the game than the line that I've written for my presentation. And it's simply going to wait a few seconds.
Moving into position.
And then it's going to pick the closest friendly NPC that is available to play an answer on. So when we're crafting these lines, we're saying this is a line that can have an answer. This is the type of answer that this can have. It doesn't have to be very specific, but we can start to have this feeling that, yes, they're talking to each other. Even though there's no real mechanic behind this, there's not any real like planning or anything complex happening behind that. It's just to create that atmosphere, just to create this connection between these people. It's obviously going to ignore the different NPCs from the different groups here, the skulls with the blue eyes, and try and find the closest one of the friendly. Okay, ambience. Time for another drink. Lovely. It's only water, I promise. Okay, so as far as ambiences go, we have nothing too surprising in terms of our basic implementation. We have our point emitters, and you can see the setup for this at the top here, and some volume emitters, which can be drawn around the world, where the sound is going to clamp to the edge of the volume while the player is outside. As the player goes inside, it's going to stick to the listener position. And I won't go too much into details about this, because we already covered this in a few years back with The Witcher 3. So we use very similar system, very similar approach. If you go check out that, you can read about how we set the ambience areas, how we used, for example, Waller systems and quad emitters in this system. But I would like to look at a couple of additional things that we did in Cyberpunk to extend this ambient system. And one kind of simple thing, but actually very effective, was our events override. So if we have a situation where we have our player, who's the samurai mask here, and some area in the world, we can mark up this area saying, okay, this area is going to have an override sound. So for a given event, a given sound, we will override it with this. If the player's outside, the game is going to play this sound.
Don't walk.
For example, the don't walk sound, if you've played Cyberpunk, then you might be overly familiar with these sounds from the crossings. And then the player's going to move inside of this area. And now, when we get this sound triggering coming through our sound system,
Don't walk.
we can override this, we can create a different one. And we can see here an example of how that might be useful, yeah? Because these sounds from the crosswalks are implemented through simple point emitters on the world. There's not really a complex logic behind them. Perhaps even they might be procedurally scattered, or a single model that is having the sound associated being played in different places. And the sound designer can say, okay, in this area of the game, this part of the city, I just want it to have a more rundown feeling. I just want it to have a bit more feeling like there's not a lot of maintenance going on here. They can draw the area around this part of the city and then override this sound. And this is the cool thing, right? Because they can do this without really needing to think about how that sound is being triggered. It could be coming from a script. It could be coming from animation, from a scene, from another ambient area, perhaps. It could be coming from the point emitters like we have in this example. All they need to think about is, at this point, right now, I want to change the sound, and very simply, they can do it with the tools that they already use. So it's an example of, sometimes we don't need a complex system, right? Sometimes something very simple will do the job and actually take us all the way that we need to go. Another way that we extended our ambient systems was with the ambient palette. And I mentioned before about we have this huge world and we need to populate it with all of this sound. And actually this is even can be too much work for us to think about for our sound designers to do, especially if we think some areas in the game may be finished later. They might not be finished in the same order that's convenient for the sound designers to work on. They might just be too much work to do. So we created an ambient palette system. The concept of which is we can tag meshes with certain brushes, and a brush represents some sound that will be played. The sound designer, then we will see is set up here with some brushes that are set for the Badlands, actually for the foliage that we have in the Badlands. So the different meshes would be tagged with these brushes, and then at runtime when they're spawned into the game, they are associated with these tags, and the sound designer can set up some different settings. Say, I want a distribution of this sound across this brush in this area. And at runtime, when we have these meshes near the player, we will just place those around. If we had a sound on every one of these meshes with the same one, it would just be too much. It would be a cacophony. And if the sound designer has to go through and manually place this in a way that would sound good, again, this is like too much work for the sound designer. We'd rather have them doing creative work, right? Using their creative skills. A really nice example of this, if you were looking closely there, you might have seen that we have some radio metadata specified in the brush. And this was a case that happened quite close to the release of the game. When we were playing it, we felt if we were in the middle of the city, if we were in the downtown areas, we just didn't have enough of the diegetic music. We have these radio stations in the game that are playing that bring a lot of character to the game because they tell us something about how the inhabitants of Night City see themselves, how they portray themselves, the sort of music that they're listening to. And so we wanted more music in the game. Too late for the sound designers to be able to go through and manually place the emitters, but we were able to add this feature to the ambient palette, and then even in just a couple of days, we were able to cover the whole of the city in the places that we wanted with these additional radios. And we can see here, well, maybe you can see here on the slides, we have an emitter here, this green emitter, and then a little further down the road, also we have another one. This was achieved by tagging the shop fronts actually with this brush, and then at runtime setting this distribution. The debug is a little hard to read here, but if you can see on the slides later that we can see the different radio stations that have brushes that are set up in the world at this time. And again, this will spread those radio stations around. We'll have a nice distribution, and then as the player's walking through the world, they will have just the right kind of cacophony, right? We want it to sound busy, we want it to sound a little bit too much, but not sound like a mess. All right. Okay, so talking about the radio, let's look a little bit about how we implemented this with the broadcast emitters. And actually, this is a technology that started off its life as one of our acoustic tools. So the starting point was for the dynamic reflections that we had in the world. Actually, you can check, there was a presentation about this on GDC by Marek Bielawski. Goes into a lot of detail about the acoustics that we had from the game. But we found out later that we could use this for more things. And the way this functions in practice is that we have a set of audio buffers, and these are read-write buffers that we have here. And we can set a broadcaster sound and point this broadcaster by the channel number to a specific buffer. And then we can create some emitter sounds, and these are going to read from this same buffer. And obviously we can have, potentially we could have multiple broadcasters to a single buffer. That's generally not the way that we're using them, but rather that we will having one broadcast sound will go to a buffer, and then any number of emitters around the world can be reading from this, playing from different positions with different processing. And how this is set up in Wise is very simple. We're going to actually set the volume down to -96, so the broadcast sound isn't actually going to make any sound. We're going to add our broadcast plugin here, and then we're going to connect up some RTPCs that are going to be able to let us to tune at runtime the channel, or to set some dB, so some volume on this. Primarily we're using this to mute the channels. So quite a simple setup there. And then on the other hand, we have a broadcast receiver. And this is behaving exactly like a normal sound, volume, low pass, high pass, pitch we can put on it. We can send this to different buses. We can apply some different effects. A delay in this case, which was a custom, simple delay, very efficient one that we could use. We can have different positioning, different distance, attenuation, and all of these sounds. And of course, we can set all of our RTPCs so that as the sound designers normally would, to be able to control this sound on each case that is using this broadcast receiver. And very simply, we're going to use the broadcast receive plugin as the source for this sound. So why is this such a powerful tool? Well, really it's super effective because the sound designers then could implement this wherever. Right? These were just plugins that we developed in Wise, a broadcast plugin and a receive plugin. And then they can put that in the mixer, the actor mixer hierarchy to do the broadcast, and they create the sounds. And any tool they already have that allows them to play a sound, they can use to create the receiver. So at this point, they don't need the programmers to help them to set this system up. Okay, sometimes we would come in and help to organize it because we have many channels, but generally they can work independently. So originally we used it for reflections, but then when it came to making the radios, okay, it was natural. Let's use this same system. It's perfect for it. We have the custom acoustics and ambience, as well as the procedural acoustics that was originally intended. The sound designers could go through the world, they can place the broadcast receivers through the world, they can add some delay, and they can craft that acoustic response for specific sounds. And sometimes also for fixing bugs. We had some cases where, for example, we needed to play a voice line from the character, but because this was some very custom setup, the character wasn't actually in the position that we wanted the voice to be in. Now, we could have gone into the voice system and added support for being able to play this from a different position, but actually it was an edge case, very simple for us. We could apply here the broadcast emitters, the broadcast would take the sound, and then we could place the voice to come out from, in the example I'm thinking of, in a phone, in a brain dance situation. So it became super useful for taking care of many different situations here. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about how we bring the world to life with voices, and then the city to life with the ambience, and then a little bit about the technology of the broadcast emitters, which is helping us to implement these things. I'd like to look now at a system which helped us to deal with the scale and the scope, the amount of sounds that we had to represent the runtime in the game. So obviously the ideal system that we would have for playing our sounds would improve the workflow of the designers. Right? It would make it easier for them to do their work so they can put more sounds into the game. It would improve our memory usage because we have many more sounds than we had before, but also much more of everything else in the game with the same amount of memory when we shipped to the previous generation of consoles, the same as The Witcher 3. Also, of course, we would like to have some better CPU performance because we have many things that need to be running, that need to be playing at the same time. And we also would like to have some better streaming performance because we have such a big city. We have many, many different things, many more variations to bringing into the memory and out of memory at runtime. So it sounds like some kind of crazy wish list. Could we have such a system? Well, I mean, obviously you've already guessed it. If we couldn't, then this would be a very short section of the talk. So our SFX container system, what this gave us, it gave us a single sound bank workflow. So this meant that sound designers could almost forget about having to assign sounds to sound banks in Wwise for most of the sound effects in the game, with a few exceptions, with, for example, with the vehicles, which had to be done manually. But for the vast majority of our sound effects, they didn't need to worry about the sound banks, about the memory management of those sound banks. For the memory, well, we were using a stream-on-demand system. So we were pulling the sounds in as we needed from the game, rather than uploading them, loading them up front when we got into a specific area or a specific portion of the world. And also we used Opus encoding, which is, as well as being higher quality encoding, also allowed us to have smaller size of the sounds. So they're going to occupy less space in memory. And the Opus encoding itself actually is more expensive, typically, especially on the previous generation of consoles. On the current generation, they have some hardware which helps with that. It takes some of the weight off it. But typically, if we compare Opus compression to Vorbis compression, the Opus is a lot more expensive, especially in Wwise, which has pretty good optimization of the Vorbis decoding. So to get around this, we were able to use asynchronous decoding. So a different approach from the standard one with Wwise. And why this was helpful is because on the previous generation of consoles, especially, there is a core that is shared with the system. And because of this, we don't really want to put our most important jobs, anything time sensitive doesn't want to go onto this core. Being able to take this decoding out of the main Wwise event, which we can't run on this core. The Wwise render itself, this has to run on the main cores. It can't be put in a situation where it's slowed down. But the decoding, we can take it out of that. We can put it onto this additional core. Sometimes we might call this the async core because we would put things there that are okay to be async. And then it's not going to be affecting, it's not going to be interfering with the time of our frames on the game. It's not going to be slowing down the FPS of the game. And we were able to use sound packs. And this is a strategy that we use to help the streaming. Of course, I've just said that we're going to stream on demand, so that sounds like we're going to be more intensive with our streaming, which, yes, this is true. We're going to have more frequent streaming. At the same time, though, we organized our sounds into packs. We collected them together into 1 megabyte chunks, which is a reasonable amount for us to read from disk, that we're not going to waste any disk seek that we're making. So even if we're going to seek for one small collision sound, we're still going to pull in a bunch of sounds for that. And not so big, though, that our very high priority audio streaming is going to get in the way of other things that need to stream in. So while we do have, let's say, more streaming happening, also generally is going to be a more even pace. We're not going to have, let's say, 30 megs of ambience coming in one block. So we were talking about the workflow. Let's go stage by stage through this system. So for the sound designers, this is how it looks. And the only thing really that once we have the original setup that they need to remember is this box that is to stream the sounds. So very important that we are going to stream the sounds, because we're going to use our conversion settings that we see on the right here are going to be set to PCM in Wwise. So Wwise, as far as it knows, it's been asked to stream PCM from disk. Typically not the kind of thing you want to do in a performance situation, right? And certainly, if we're concerned about memory, we're not going to want to have PCM data in memory. This is uncompressed audio, the full size, of course, full quality as well, but For us, absolutely we need to have that compression on. And the conversion settings, this is set at the top of the SFX tree in the actor mixer hierarchy. So basically we set this once and then we can forget about it. Anything that's been put under the SFX in Wise, this is automatically going to have the correct conversion settings. And at the bottom here we see the soundbank editor, the SFX container. So in our soundbank editor, we're going to set up a tree which has all of the different categories of sounds, and then as sound designers are adding their events, automatically these are going to be pulled into the SFX container. So really, if they're going to add something, any normal SFX, all they have to do is add their event, add their sound in the correct place, and the SFX container is going to take care of the rest. Okay, so we have our setup in Wise. Of course, as we said, we don't want to have this PCM audio in the game, and we still have some steps. So we have an additional process that is going to trigger after the soundbank build, our container build process. And as part of this, we're going to go through all of the work units, all of the WWU XML files from Wise. We're going to parse them so that we can collect the event media. So we're looking per event what media is associated with this event, especially from the sound effects container soundbank. Obviously, these are the ones that we want to process. Then, of course, now we're going to convert these to Opus. We're going to do this ourselves behind the scenes. And then we're going to collect all of these events, so event-wise, all this media, and put them into these 1 meg Opus pack chunks. So every sound that we have can be associated with the closest events. And we do this because this is more likely that if we have one event, that some similar event nearby associated in the Wise hierarchy can be triggered in a similar time frame. So generally, we're going to be getting some sounds that we're likely to want to use perhaps soon. Not always, but automatically when we do this stream, we will pull them into memory. Okay, so we have our containers built, we have our sound packs, and also an info file that is going to tell us where sounds are living within the different containers. And we're going to pull this into the runtime, and how are we then going to interpret this? Because Wise thinks, of course, that it's going to be requesting actually for this PCM data. Well, the request to play the sound will come as normal, so an event will be played, this will go to Wise, and then Wise is going to say, stream me some PCM data. We're going to intercept that, we're going to catch it, and we're going to see if this is a container sound, if this is something that is handled by a container system, do we already have it in the Opus cache? So we're going to cache these blocks that we're bringing in. We're going to keep them in memory because, as we said, we have some kind of prediction that the sounds that are in there might be used again in the near future. Let's assume that we don't have it in the Opus cache. So we're going to stream in that Opus pack that's containing the sound. And then once we have this in memory, then we can schedule our async decode of the Opus file if we're going to do the decode async. That's going to go away. It's going to go to the async core or to another thread. We're going to decode the whole audio, and then when we have this, we will just pass this data back to Wise. So let's take a look a little bit at the code for this, and this is pseudocode, so it's not the exact code that we had here, but just to illustrate the flow. Of course, if you implement it yourself, you would need some additional code in here. So there's two functions that we need to override from Wise. First is that we need to create a streaming resolver open function. So this is when Wise wants to open the file. And the first thing we want to check if it can be opened in the container. So if this fails, we're going to cascade down to the second option, the open resource depot file. So this has told us, okay, we don't have a container sound, open it as normal for streaming, right? Because we still have two streaming mechanisms at the moment then. We have the container streaming and the normal streaming, which we're going to use for VO, which we're going to use for music. And also a special case here, because we want to keep in mind the workflow of the sound designers, and I just said we added a whole nother process onto the build system. So we need to mitigate this. We have an option called the no container mode. The sound designers can trigger this, and in this case, it will read the PCM, it will stream the PCM, and it's just going to fail this first clause, and we're going to have the PCM files on disk only on PC, of course, this is going to work, and we're going to allocate an additional gig of memory just for the audio to be able to cope with this rather heavy streaming. But this means that the sound designers can then work in Wise, they can make the sound bank build, and they don't need to do the container build additionally if they want to iterate on their sounds. The second function from Wise that we need is to implement the read. So this is where we're going to check, do we have the file cached already? If we have the file cached, great. We'll just pass this to Wise. He's had an instantaneous stream, lovely. That's what we like to see. And if that fails, then we're going to ask it to make a stream to our standard streaming system. This is just a normal streaming call. All right. So, a few additional things that we need to do then, because we need to handle actually the processing, actually the decoding of those files. We have our hooks now from Wise. We've intercepted those signals, and we're going to start actually at the end of the Wise frame. So we're going to place our work into the pre and post callbacks from Wise so that we can be sure that Wise isn't running while we're doing our container system stuff. This is going to make it simpler for us from the point of the multi-threading. Okay, Wise can be running on any thread. We can be running our container work on any thread. We're not going to have to place additional locks or any synchronization. That's just going to naturally fall out of this. And we want to start at the end because this is after we've had any requests from Wise. So Wise has been through one iteration, one of its update loops. It's had event messages come from the game. It's going to have started to generate this data. So let's jump to our post callback at the bottom here and walk through this. So our first thing that we want to do here is we want to go through process the closed files. So anything that we finish now, we want to free up the resources from this. The next phase will be processing the prefetches. So this is actually something else that I didn't mention, because we want to have the ability of overcoming some of the latency that can be generated by the streaming. We want, in some cases, just to be able to say, I know that this sound is going to be needed. A great example would be when the player equips a weapon. Okay, if the player is equipping a gun, we want the fire sound from the gun in memory. We don't need to wait for the player to fire, and when they do fire, we need that sound straight away. So we implemented a system where we could, event-wise, find the sounds that are in specific sound packs, pull them into the memory. Then we want to process the new reads. So these are requests that have come from Wise. We're going to say, okay, we have some requests from Wise. We're going to queue these up. Next is to kick off any file I/O on our side. So this is going to our low-level streaming system. So we have two levels of streaming. This is going to go directly to the lower one. We know what we want. We know when we want it. And here we can set some different priorities for how fast we need this to come. Example would be, if we're in a very heavy streaming situation, then we might say, okay, for some sounds now, we will resign from the highest priority of streaming so that, for example, the physics can come in, so that the gameplay can come in, so that we can make sure that everything is looking good. But for sure, if we have some voices or some scene specific I/O to do, then we still need these at the fastest priority. And this comes because, of course, the game itself is very demanding on the streaming, and in some situations, then we really need to be very careful about that, even though we have a more generally smooth streaming profile. And finally here, we're going to see that we have the process completed hardware reads, so something that we introduced later with the current generation of consoles where we have hardware opus decoding. We added to the system the ability to use this hardware. It makes sense. And this has to happen through a slightly different mechanism, the way we're going to queue up those files and send them to the hardware to get decoded. And now we know all of the files that we want to decode from here. So we're going to just go through all of the open files that we have. We're going to open that for decode with our Opus library, and we're going to say, okay, now add this to our number of Opus files decodes that we've created. After we've looped through those, we're going to hit that onto the semaphore. So now on the semaphore, we have a queue of files, the number of files that we need to decode. So we loop all the way around the frame, or perhaps not the frame, because whys can happen multiple times in the game frame, but until the next whys processing frame that we have, and we're going to hit into the pre-callback. And now, again, we just want to make sure, do we have any new reads that have come in the meantime, something that we need to add into our queue, but also, do we have any processed do we need to process any completed transfers? So these are the Opus files that are now ready to use. Right? This is the point where we won't need to pass it back to whys, and this is going to happen at the last possible moment before whys renders. So right before that, if we have any, we can pass it to whys. Whys will then be able to play the sounds. And we're talking about the async part of this, so we do have a separate thread that's running, very simple. All that we have is the semaphore that we saw before. So if there has been anything set on the semaphore, can we acquire it? Okay, it means that we have a file, take the first file from the queue, and then we're just going to run through that whole file, decode the whole thing, and then pass this off, move on to the next decode. And of course, we need to check if the thread's shutting down. Once we have our system, we need to seek to the position of the file. Sometimes we're not starting from the beginning. And move to the next decode. Okay, so we're talking about a system that is really about finding optimizations, about how we do that. So let's just review a couple of these that we have. I mentioned the Opus cache that we have. So this is where we're caching our sounds that we've streamed in. We have about a 40 megabyte block of this, so it's about 40 of these 1 meg blocks, with us evicting the oldest ones as they come, unless something's been pinned into the cache. We're also using this event adjacent sound, which gives us some level of prediction, and we can also frame in whys. We can arrange our events in such a way that will support this, but generally we're relying on just the natural order of this. This actually is probably the one place where you can get the most extra optimization to come in if we could find improved heuristics for how to arrange those sounds together. Something maybe for the future to look into. We have our async decode, which is going to let us to get that decoding out of the way of our game frame, out of the jobs that we have where our performance is critical. And additionally, we're going to set a large whys streaming cache. So this is the cache that whys itself would normally use for streaming. In this case, it's going to be caching the PCM data. So the benefit we get from this, of course, is going to avoid streaming something else, because whys won't even make the request to do the stream if it has in the cache. But also, this is the PCM data. So also, we're going to save on any decodes that need to be done, because it already has that in place. And if we compare this to The Witcher 3, we have about a 30 megabytes saving of memory. Well, it might not sound that much. Actually, it's quite big for us to do that, especially in terms of we've doubled the number of total assets in the game. We have many more different types of sounds to have. We have this more complex environment. And actually, this memory amount doesn't just include the memory for whys. So in Witcher, when we think about our audio memory, this is just the amount of memory we reserved for whys, for the sounds that were loaded in, for the whys data structures. On Cyberpunk, this also includes all of the code structures that we had in our audio systems, also all of our localization data that we have stored in, also our acoustic graphs, and all of these other things. So actually, we're able to add all of this extra stuff into the game, all of these extra features, and at the same time save memory, which is pretty cool. Okay, so I've been talking all about the pros of this system. So we have the improved workflow, memory, the quality from the Opus. It means that we have actually a big jump in quality if we consider the native compression that we were using on Witcher 3 for the consoles. A big difference there, maybe some small difference from the Vorbis that we would be using on PC. We do have some improvement in the streaming profile there, although we need to be a little cautious about that, and actually potentially for the CPU, even with this more expensive decoding. But, of course, nothing is entirely for free, so there are some cons to this. The first being that this is a lot of work, right? This is a whole big system, pipelines that have to be created. It took us a long time to build this up. And really, I want to hit this home. Like, if you're thinking about doing it, I think this is a really cool system for the benefits that we get, but really take into account the amount of work that is included in this, and that continues to be needed, because once you've created it, this is something that you've made yourself. It's not something that's supported by Audio Kinetic, of course, or anyone else, so you're going to need to keep that ticking over. And also, as part of this, it's quite complex, because we're talking about a multi-threaded system. Always, there's some complexities there. Also, you need to understand a little bit of how WISE is working under the hood to be able to hook those things up, to be able to work this in a good way, and also your streaming system in the game. So lots of pieces to connect together there. The build process iteration I mentioned. So it can be slower for the sound designers to iterate if we don't take care of this sound container build. If they're having to do a sound container build, or if they want to, for example, check really how their sound in the game, including with compression, then there's a whole extra stage. And this grows longer the bigger the game gets, the more number of sounds that we have in there. And of course, we are introducing some latency here, because we're streaming everything. So there's, however fast our streaming is going to be, even if we have the SSDs, even the new fast SSDs that we have on, especially on the PS5 and the current generation of consoles, still there's some latency there. And in some cases, that can be too much. Although generally, it was working pretty well. So these are the considerations that we need to have. For the latency, we need to have this way to pin sounds that I mentioned, this way to do prefetches to say, here's the sound, bring this into the cache now. We were doing it for the player weapons. We were doing it for the sounds in scenes. We would have some look ahead in the scenes. Also, the streaming worst cases are tough. So if we're driving through the city at full pace, then there can be really heavy demand, and it can get too much for us. So in this case, we also need to come back to our pinning, the collisions for the vehicles. When the player gets in the vehicle, let's get them in. We will need them quickly, and we don't want to have to make a stream seek for this while we're pulling in other graphics. And also cull as many sounds as possible. If it's not important, and we're driving along, and there's a firefight, and there's the radio blasting, okay, we can start to make some choices about maybe there's some sounds that we don't need to be playing in the game. The debugging can be non-trivial of the system that is complex. So as much as possible, add some tests that will run sounds through this pipeline and harden that code as much as possible. If you get some crash in some Opus data that's corrupted, which may or may not have happened, and that happens at the end of the pipeline, you need a way to be able to find out when this corruption is happening. If you remember back to the beginning, there was this one box I said the sound designers have to tick. What happens if they don't tick that? Well, if they don't tick that, then WISE is going to load this PCM into memory, and it's going to sit in memory through the whole game. So, really important, just don't allow it. We have a separate sound build that's running our build machines. If a sound in the container isn't marked as streaming, then we will simply fail the build. A message goes to the sound designers, to the audio programmers. We can fix this very quickly. And now we have some scripts also that help with this process. The iteration, I mentioned it before, that this can be slow if we're going to have this always this sound container build. So add this no container mode that's going to do this. Okay, 5 minutes, perfect, because I've just reached the conclusion of the talk. So we've looked through just a few of the audio technologies, right? There's lots more that I would love to talk about from what we did on Cyberpunk, and also that we were always thinking of how to bring Night City to life. How are we going to create this feeling of a living, breathing, almost creature that is the city? A few ways that we can do that. We're looking at the view of the inhabitants of that city, of the characters there, making sure that they can talk, that they can interact. Obviously tell the story. Ambience is a critical part, because this is the sound of the city itself. To be able to cope with that scale, to be able to have many, many details, many different kinds, and how to help the sound designers to be able to implement this through. We've seen that because we had such a huge scale, because we had such a big game, we needed to create some custom solutions for this. We needed to build some technology that would help both on the workflow side and in terms of runtime to be able to handle all of this. But also, sometimes the simple can go a long way. We remember to the example about the ambient area override, very simple technology. Sometimes that's all you need. And sometimes you can have a technology that you will use for one thing, like with our broadcast emitters, and actually then you'll find this is useful in many places. So don't be shy to just reuse that where it is appropriate. But when it's worth it. It can be good to go deeper. You can get some big wins if you're not afraid to really get stuck in and make some huge changes. And thank you.
Thank you, Colin. Do you have any questions? No? Yes? Okay. One question.
Okay. Hi, very nice talk. I never did any coding in audio or something like that, but do you know maybe is it sense of doing something like sound ray tracing, like to make just simple sound and then all effects should be done physically? Yeah?
So I think this is partly an approach which we had something like this, like not full ray tracing for the sounds, but we did listener-based reverb in a separate talk. It's a whole thing by itself. But there's also some, let's say, kind of philosophical difference here of approach that you can take. One is to make the most realistic sounds that you want to have, like a pure physical simulation. And the other is, like, do you want to have a more creative approach? Generally for us, we want something in between. We want a situation where there is dynamic audio in that the player is experiencing the sound change, for example, as they're moving around the area that they're in, that they're going to hear that sound change, but also that the sound designers really have a lot of control and a lot of easy control to completely change the sound, to completely reshape this, to use a different custom reverb, for example. In each different area, they can say, these are the reverbs that will be used dynamically. Some people might go with the full procedural approach. For us, we like to sit somewhere in the middle.
So it's not always fun to have just physical.
Yeah, exactly, and I think this really will be case by case, depending on the game. If we think in like the cinematic sense, like we often talk about trying to use cinematic aesthetics and use techniques that have been used in audio in linear media for a long time, which they have like very rich history, then often we need to subvert the reality there. And sometimes also, if we think like, for example, with the acoustics, sometimes the acoustics in places just isn't good. And we would still like it to sound good, right? So sometimes we want to step away from the reality there.
Okay, thank you very much. Do you have any questions? Yes? We don't have many time, so...
If you have more questions, then I will be around outside after as well.
It's a quick one. In terms of the 1 megabyte chunk sound packs, how were they divided up? Was that just sort of arbitrary, programmatic, or was there sort of rules?
Yeah, so the main rule that we used here is associating the media by the events that are going into the sound pack. So if you have events that are adjacent in wise, then the sounds will be, the media for those events will be adjacent in the sound packs. Of course, that's not 100% perfect, because if a media file is reused in different events, then it would be like in different sound packs or done differently. But generally, the idea here is not that we had was not to have it perfect, but just to have it like good enough to have that. I do think it can be better, right? This is like quite a rough rule. In the end, it was, let's say, enough for us. 1 megabyte we chose because we were streaming from hard disk, and we felt, okay, 1 megabyte for a seek across the hard disk, 1 megabyte is enough for us to feel comfortable that it was worth for us to go across to the other side of the disk. Maybe now we would consider smaller sizes. The SSDs, they don't have this thing. Okay, we probably still don't want to go file by file, but I don't know. We haven't found like what's the ideal spot of the new, but probably smaller is like right for an SSD only situation.
Okay, thank you very much, Colin.
Thank you.